Welcome to this video about how winds aloft affects aircraft gliding performance during engine out emergencies. For the record, I'm filming this on January 25th of 2021. So when a controller is presented with an aircraft that has had an engine failure, it's true that some days up at altitude the winds are calm, but usually there are some winds aloft. Some days they're weak, some days they're strong. How do these winds aloft affect gliding performance? That's what we're going to look at. We're going to talk about what controllers should do, if anything, to adjust for these winds aloft so that we can maximize survivability odds for aircraft in these situations. So first of all, just a quick overview. I'm going to argue in this video that winds aloft can have, they don't necessarily do, but they can have an absolutely enormous effect on aircraft glide performance. You will find that I am also going to argue that this is widely misunderstood and is not appreciated, and that controllers need to think about this. Therefore, kind of going forward to my conclusion, in my opinion, in engine failure situations, controllers must very quickly assess the winds aloft, and then I'll give you some advice later on in this video about when the winds aloft are strong enough to really be a tipping point to really drastically affect the situation. In effect, if the winds aloft are strong, what I want controllers to think about is something really simple. Airplanes should typically, they don't necessarily want to do this, but they should typically think about gliding downwind and then turning around to land upwind. That is absolutely what I would do if it was my butt in the airplane. It passes that test. And if I'm the controller talking to an airplane in one of these situations and there are strong winds aloft, unless there is some overriding concern to do otherwise, I will think, in terms of the vectoring I use, about sending a pilot to glide downwind and turning around to land upwind. So let's get started, okay? So first of all, I'm going to call this the refresher of the prerequisites. Sounds like a Victorian novel or something, right? Okay. There are at least 3 videos that I just want to very quickly touch on just by way of refresher. So in one of the foundational ground school videos, we introduced the glider polar to you, just that plot of sink or descent rate versus airspeed. It has that typical shaped curve. In the video about the basics of engine failure gliding performance for controllers, I gave a simplistic takeaway. Though every situation will be unique, I said that a lot of typical single engine GA airplanes are going to cluster at something like 90 knots glide speed and 1,000 feet per minute. Certainly the trainers are going to be slower than that, but they'll also descend a little bit slower. And I mentioned that while that might be a tad optimistic in terms of the overall average that we would see as controllers out there in the real world, those are nice round numbers and they're very useful for teaching purposes. So to keep things simple, I'm going to assume that we're dealing with an airplane that's going to glide at about 90 knots airspeed, about 1,000 feet per minute, and that's going to make the mental math very easy. Also, I did a video about how aircraft weight affects gliding performance, and the simplistic takeaway on that one, just by way of reminder, is that weight does not affect the ideal glide ratio in still air as long as pilots fly the appropriate speed for the weight of their aircraft. A lot of them don't. A lot of them are flying at what they think of as like the best glide speed for that aircraft. However, that's normally the best glide speed for max gross weight. They're typically operating at less than max gross weight, and it's not uncommon for them to be 10 or 15% over the speed that they really should be gliding at. And so they're already taking a performance hit. You will find that in certain cases that actually can be helpful once we add in stuff about the winds, but we'll kind of get to that in a little bit. So as far as the wind, there's a couple of basic ways to think about this. So first of all, let's just understand that the airplane is going to drift with the wind regardless. So again, let's start with an airplane, and we're just assuming that it's gliding at 90 knots and 1,000 feet per minute. And for the sake of discussion, again, this makes the mental math easy. Let's assume that the wind is at 30 knots. 30 is coincidentally 1/3 of the 90 knots glide airspeed that we're assuming for this, what we're loosely calling an average airplane in this kind of situation. If they turn and are gliding directly into the wind because they think that's where the nearest airport is, what's their ground speed going to be? Well, this is pretty simple. 90 knots airspeed, 30 knots wind. They're going to have 60 knots of ground speed. That might vary just a little tiny bit because the winds aloft will shift with altitude. And there's going to be a slight discrepancy between indicated airspeed and true airspeed, the kinds of altitudes where we're talking about, typically below 10 or 12,000 for most cases. But we're going to ignore that to keep the mental math easy so that you can understand the concepts. So in this example, somebody would turn into the wind because that's the direction they want to go. They're only doing 60 knots across the ground, and they're doing 1,000 feet per minute. By the way, if you just take that feet per minute and divide by 100, so that just becomes 10, you have 60 knots forward, you have 10 knots down, which is the equivalent of 1,000 feet per minute. That's 60 to 10, that's a 6-to-1 glide ratio. That's not a good glide ratio. If they turn and happen to go downwind because they're going to an airport that happens to be downwind, let's say, they're going to do 120 knots ground speed at the same 1,000 feet per minute. That's equivalent to 10 knots descent rate. That's a 12-to-1 ratio. They are doubling the glide ratio in the real world with the winds aloft in that example. And in fact, this is true anytime the winds aloft are 1/3 the glide speed. An airplane can go twice as far downwind as it can upwind. I don't have a slide that's going to show this, but if you want to think about what the algebra would look like, just picture that the airspeed, you add 1/3 for the tailwind, so that gives you 4/3. You subtract 1/3 for the headwind, that gives you 2/3, and 4/3 is twice 2/3. That's why you can go twice as far downwind as you can go upwind. Because a lot of the training type airplanes, as I'll call them, a lot of the PA-28s, certainly anything like a Tomahawk or a Musketeer in the Beechcraft line, or sorry, Tomahawk's a Piper. If Cessna 152, 172 airplanes, these are going to glide something on the order of about 60 knots to get to that 1/3 glide speed. You're only talking 20 knots of wind. So something like 20 or 30 knots of wind is all it takes to go twice as far downwind as you can go upwind. There are some effects if you're going crosswind. I'll give you kind of a graphical depiction of that in a couple of minutes and so on. So with that in mind, let's go to this right here, and we'll do it right now. So all I did here on Microsoft Whiteboard is I just basically freehand drew a circle. I kind of put up a loose grid up here, and I've got it broken off without labeling the distances. But if our airplane is in the center here when it loses the engine, and assuming there's no wind, okay, it in theory can go in any direction. We're kind of discounting that initial turn. Maybe this airplane's heading north and could go a little farther north than it could south because it would have to do a 180. But to a first approximation, ignoring that, it can go anywhere within some distance. So that creates a circle where the radius is equal to the expected glide distance. Now I've got this set up as if it's some multiple of 3, who knows what it is. So if this is 2 miles, that's 4, that's 6. So maybe it can go 6 miles in any direction. Maybe that's 3 miles between these kind of grid lines, and so it could go 9 miles in any direction. I'm not per se worried about the scale. Here's what happens. That's where it can go if there is no wind. What if there's wind? Well, the entire time that it's coming down, and again, let's assume that we're talking about a plane that's going 90 knots through the air, but 30 knots of wind. That 30 knots of wind is 0.5 miles per minute. And so you take the number of minutes that the airplane will be descending and multiply that by 0.5. That's going to give you the drift. And essentially what happens is, and I'm going to do it this way, I'm just going to grab this circle, which all I did was copy that one. And so if that represents where the airplane can go from that starting point, from the same starting point, if for the sake of discussion the winds are out of the west at 30 knots, in effect you just shift the center of the circle over by that 1/3 distance, and that's why if the original distance out to here was 1, 2, 3 sets of lines, I just moved the new center to here. Okay, and so this second circle off to the right is now the area where the airplane can go. And that leads to an interesting takeaway, because you might think maybe it's unfair that we're talking about an airplane that can only go directly upwind or directly downwind, and it goes twice as far downwind as it does upwind. It's actually, in effect, even worse than that, or better, depending on how you look at it, and here's why. Let me take the ruler, I'm just going to kind of put it here, and I'm going to grab just a highlighter, and we're going to sort of bisect. Again, assuming that the wind is from the west in this case, we're going to assume for discussion purposes that the wind is from due west, and so that entire circle shifts off this way. So in effect, what happens is, Everything to the west of this line represents the area in this circle here that the airplane can glide to just because of physics into the wind, even if they're heading off at some kind of crosswind angle. And this area that I'm going to just continue to highlight in green here, oops, sorry, let me do this. Okay, so if I take this part of the circle here loosely all the way around, okay, and if I were to spend a few minutes sort of coloring this whole circle in, you can tell I broke the government budget on this one. That represents the area where the airplane can glide if it kind of turns downwind and looks. And this represents the area, conceptually, if the wind is 1/3 the glide speed, that it can glide if it goes upwind. You can just eyeball it. That green area is a lot bigger than this kind of pink area. So that's why I say think downwind, and this becomes, if you sit down and do the math, this is more than twice the area downwind as it is upwind. So can you reach some airports or things upwind? Yes. What if it's all mountains over here to the east and it's farm fields to the west? By all means, head west. You can certainly go into the wind. But unless there is some kind of compelling difference, maybe this airplane's over Milwaukee. Over Milwaukee, this is all Lake Michigan. That's beautiful Wisconsin. I would head for beautiful Wisconsin, okay? If, on the other hand, this is on the Michigan shore of Lake Michigan, okay, I would not head into the wind and land Lake Michigan. I'd go well into Michigan, right? The idea is you have to use some common sense, but unless there is some compelling thing like that, an urban area that you want to avoid, terrain that you want to avoid, good terrain that you want to head for or something, typically think about going downwind instead of going upwind. Okay, we're going to come back to this in a minute, so I am going to clear the canvas, and no, that's not what I want. Rats. All right, there we go. We're going to come back to this in a little bit. So first of all, I thought what we would do is get a live example of what's this looks like. So I am filming this, as I said, on Monday, January 25th. And so right now, this is the live wind plot for the surface winds across basically the 48 lower states. We're interested more in the winds aloft. So let's take a look at the live winds aloft at 3,000 feet. Okay, over by the area around Memphis, just south of Memphis and so on, where you see this orange. Right there, the winds are up to like 50 to 60 knots or so. And this area here, kind of coming across just west of New Orleans, up through that Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas area, up into most of Tennessee, even at just 3,000 MSL. Those winds aloft speeds right now are 40 to 50 knots. That's a significant wind. If you have an airplane, let's say right over here in that tri-state area, let's say, they have an engine failure and they ask for the nearest airport, and you say, oh, it just happens to be that the nearest airport is something like a 220 bearing from there, they're hardly going to make any headway into that wind. You can go downwind and drift for half the day, basically. Now, that's clearly an exaggeration, but the idea is you have to take those winds into account. Look at how much of the country where we don't have higher terrain like in the Rockies, okay? Look at how much of this is at least blue, where the wind is at least 20 knots for this kind of deeper blue rather than the really light blue that kicks in at 15 knots. There's a significant part of the country, now again, this varies day to day to be clear, but there's a significant swath of the country where the winds are at least 20 knots. That is absolutely enough for controllers to be thinking about. If the airplane is somewhat higher, here are the winds live as we record this at 6,000 feet. I mean, pretty much all of Tennessee at 6,000 feet, the winds are over 50 knots. Okay, so you do want to keep that in mind. So what I thought I would do, we'll see if this works out. You never know in a live demonstration. I'm going to pick that part of the country, and I'm going to see if we can find a suitable airplane, or a couple of airplanes rather. So I'm going to do this. First of all, I'm going to make the map more full screen. I'm going to zoom in on kind of that Tennessee, Huntsville, Memphis area. I know Memphis is in Tennessee. And let's just restrict this down to airplanes that are below about 10,000 or so. That's probably going to pretty much dictate the speed that we're going to see anyway, but we'll kind of do something like that. So let's see who's up flying right now. Okay, let's grab this airplane over here that's kind of just southeast of the Nashville area. He's northeast bound, so I'm guessing this airplane, whatever it is, we'll see what we get, is got a pretty good tailwind. So a 172 to, oh, look at this. Oh, yes. Oh, you have my word. Oh, I love this. Look at this guy. This is a 172. Oh, this is beautiful. Okay, so this guy, it looks like, took off from Smyrna, went down here. I'm guessing this is somebody who's working on their instrument rating. Who knows? Maybe just instrument currency. And they did some holding and then came down here to Maury County, came over here, did an approach into Shelbyville, and then they're working their way back up to Smyrna because that's what that says. Look at the ground speed plot. Oh, I love this. This is perfect. Look what happened to this guy's ground speed. So he takes off. He's heading into the wind, and he's doing, I know this says miles per hour, but okay, he's doing like 60 across the ground. I mean, and then suddenly he goes to do the first turn in the hold. Look at the ground speed. I'm just reading it off here. 200 miles an hour. The guy's been doing 60. He goes into the hold. He's doing 200. He turns back in on the inbound leg, and he's like in a hover at 60 knots. This is fantastic. You'd be surprised. This is the kind of stuff that, well, anyway, I don't want to get in trouble. So 197 on the downwind leg. He turns in. He's doing 70. He turns downwind again. He's doing 180. He's like, all right, okay, and then he goes back in. So he does his approach. The speed's going to vary in the approach. Now he turns eastbound. Look at that. The speed again is fluctuating a little bit, but this guy's going real fast. He's a bit more into the wind here as he's coming in. Plus he's slowing for the approach, so the speed's much slower. He then turns to go up here towards Murfreesboro. Okay, look at that speed again. That's perfect, all in one airplane. I was thinking I was going to get one airplane, maybe northeastbound, one southbound, and so on. So, all right, if the camera was on me right now, you would see a genuine smile because this is like perfect for my teaching purposes. So right now, live, whoever's working this airplane, I don't know if it's Nashville Approach or Memphis Center or whoever, but back, let's even put him back here, when he was kind of back north of Ellington, let's say. If he's somewhere, let's put him right about here. I can't do the math necessarily live, but right now, 5,200 feet, again, this was, 20 minutes ago, 30 minutes ago, but if this airplane had had an engine failure right now, I'm guessing that Ellington is about as reachable as Maury County. Certainly, by the time the airplane is here, I guarantee you, with strong winds, okay, Ellington is going to be kind of a crosswind. He turns into Maury County. He's never going to make it. He's going to turn around and he's going to park it right about by that road is all that airplane would make. I'm telling you that controllers need to take these winds into account. Granted, the 50 knot or 60 knot wind that this guy is getting is stronger than usual, but all right, that made my day. We're on a roll now. Okay, let's do this. Let's pop over to the Glider Flying Handbook because clearly Glider Flying Handbook is going to tell us something about how to adjust for this kind of stuff. This is a concept known, if I go to the PowerPoint again real quick, as speed to fly. So that's what we're looking for. Chapter 7, we are not interested in the launch and recovery procedures part of this chapter. We're interested in the flight maneuvers part. And under operating airspeeds, it's going to talk about minimum sink airspeed that we've talked about, best glide airspeed that we've talked about, and the speed to fly, which is what we want to look at. We'll start with page 7-36 because that's where you're going to find the minimum sink airspeed. We've covered that. I'm not going to say anything more about it. Best glide speed, I'll spend 2 seconds just by way of reminder. The best glide speed is defined as the airspeed that results in the least amount of altitude loss over a given distance. Alternatively, you can think of it as the greatest distance for a given amount of altitude loss. And this allows the glider to glide the greatest distance in still air. Well, good luck doing that in the Memphis or Nashville area right now, okay? So, glider pilots think about this thing called the speed to fly. Much is said about the importance of maintaining the best gliding speed, but what is important is to maintain an optimum glide speed, including a penetration speed that takes atmospheric conditions into account. So, for example, air that's sinking or rising and a headwind or a tailwind. Sinking is something you got to kind of fight. Headwind is something you got to kind of fight. So that's why they're really emphasizing it there. The gliding community refers to this as speed to fly. We come up with really creative stuff, okay? The normal recommendation for countering a headwind is to add 1/3 to 1/2 of the estimated wind speed to whatever your normal best glide speed would be. Now that does increase the rate of sink because it increases the speed that you're flying. However, it's also increasing the ground speed. If you were to work through all of that, what it's doing is it's improving your actual glide ratio in the real world in those wind conditions. Again, so what you do is you add speed to your otherwise normal best glide speed if you're going into a headwind. If instead you're going to do a tailwind, you deduct about 1/3 to 1/2 the estimated wind speed from the best glide speed. Now that reduces both the rate of sink up to a point, unless you're ridiculously slow, okay? But it also reduces the ground speed that you would otherwise have, but you're now riding the tailwind and you're maximizing the time that the tailwind is really helping you. That's one way to look at it. And then I'm going to do my own version of what they display as figure 7-35 just to make it a little bit easier, but we will use it. So it says, to illustrate this, the polar curve in figure 7-35 indicates the optimum glide speed when adjusted for headwind, tailwind, or sinking air. So for a tailwind, A, the starting point, and I'm just going to zoom in so it's a little bit easier to see some of these lines. Okay, so for a tailwind, the starting point on the horizontal scale has been moved a distance to the left corresponding to the tailwind velocity. So before, when I was drawing that line for the best glide ratio, I was starting at the 0, 0 origin point. For a tailwind, all you do is move the origin point, okay, to the left on the x-axis, and whatever speed the tailwind is, that's where you would move it, and you start the line from there to get to your tangent point. If you think about the shape of this curve, by definition, that speed, that's your speed to fly, okay, which was originally, let's say, B with this kind of red line here. Well, if you move that starting point back, that speed has to slow down. So you slow down in a tailwind. Now, that's what you should do. Is that what pilots actually do in engine failure situations? Is that what a controller should say? I'm going to say that most pilots don't know that. I'm going to say that even though it seems like I'm going to, recommend that controllers tell pilots to slow down, I would not do that because they're not going to really understand what's going on. I think they might be worried that we're trying to make them stretch the glide and so on. So they will be operating with a tailwind at a speed that is less than the optimum speed to fly, the way that glider pilots would think about it. However, they're still getting the benefit of the tailwind. So in effect, they're not maximizing that benefit as much as a skilled glider pilot would, but they're still getting benefit. It's still a good thing. So in effect, they're still just sort of descending normally through the air, but they're getting a free ride from the tailwind. They're kind of drifting with the wind. However, if somebody goes into the wind, because again, you're trying to stay away from Lake Michigan, head for Wisconsin, or get away from mountains that are, downwind or something. Okay, if you're going to glide into the wind, you want to increase your speed. And again, if you want to visualize that, you just, instead of starting from the 0, 0 point, you just shift according to the wind speed, and then you start your tangent line from there. By physical definition, if you're drawing a tangent line from a right shifted origin to this kind of a curve, that speed is going to move over to the right. We don't care about the sinking air, so we're going to ignore the yellow line, the yellow D, and so on. But anyway, so you slow down for a tailwind, you speed up into a headwind. And if you remember the video I did about how aircraft weight affects glide performance, I said that most pilots are flying faster than they really should for the weight. Ironically, if they are going to glide into the wind, they should be slowing down for their light weight, but then speeding up because of the headwind. If you work through all of that, it tends to be the case, okay? In most cases, there will always be exceptions, but in most cases, pilots, if they are going to go into the wind when they're gliding, end up flying at about the right speed to fly, kind of by accident. They're not thinking in terms of, I need to slow down for my weight, need to speed up because of a tailwind or headwind, and those kind of balance out. So, I'm at the proper speed to fly. No, they end up there at the right speed for the wrong reason. Now, I want to be clear about something here. Is it better for a pilot like that to go into the wind at the proper speed to fly, kind of by accident, or to fly the wrong speed when going downwind? It is still better to fly at the wrong speed downwind than it is at the right speed headwind. The headwind is still going to fight how far you can go. That 172 we were looking at a couple minutes ago, even if he flew the right kind of speed, okay, upwind, sort of by accident, he's never going to make Maury County. And if he flies the wrong speed downwind, he was going to make Ellington. Again, I'd have to sit down and maybe look at the numbers, but that would absolutely be my live recommendation if I was the one working that airplane in emergency and he said he needed vectors to the closest airport and Maury County is a tad closer. It doesn't matter. Maury's never reachable. It's better to go downwind and so on. So having said that, just be aware that into a headwind, where we really do want to optimize, pilots are sort of optimizing by mistake. Cool, okay? So in effect, there's nothing to do. And again, if they're downwind, we're just kind of getting that benefit. and so on. So let me just illustrate this separately very briefly and just do my own version of that. So I'm going to go to Microsoft Whiteboard. Let me draw this as fast as I can here. So give me just a second. So I'm just going to quickly draw kind of that vertical line. I'm going to draw the horizontal line. Oops, let's do that. Okay, I'm going to set this for ballpark 20ish just for illustration purposes. Oh, I misplaced blue. Let's make this one blue. I was doing something else earlier. And okay, so I'm just going to do blue for that best glide in still air. Get rid of the ruler for a second. I'm going to use red. I'm going to freehand draw this, and close enough. I'm trying to make it kind of tangent and kind of drop off. Yeah, close enough for freehand for a live shot. Okay, we're going to use that. So here's the thing. Let's just take the ruler. If we have a tailwind, okay, and we were to anchor it, you know, somewhere back here, I'll just do green. So with a tailwind, we might come like this, and by definition, it's a little hard to tell here just because of the freehand. This isn't quite the curve, but that speed shifts back this way in a tailwind. If instead we're looking, if instead we're looking at a headwind, okay, you shift the speed. Man, that was kind of a lousy curve in the area where I needed it. Whoops, that's not what I wanted. Give me, rats. Okay. That's what happens when I'm going too fast. Ruler, please. Thank you. Okay. So if this was a curve, where it's supposed to be a curve, you would shift, and that speed would shift higher in a headwind. That's what you get in a live high-budget demonstration. So basically, again, you never need to worry about this, but the rule of thumb, just for awareness, we're not ever going to do anything with it. For the 1/3 to 1/2 of the glider flying handbook that was being used for gliders, I would say for typical single-engine airplanes, what I would do is I would add about 1/3 of the headwind if I was flying into a headwind. For a tailwind, I would subtract about 1/4 of that wind speed. Again, not a big deal. We're not going to do it anyway, so I'm not too wrapped up in that. I will give you a practical example of this just to show you something here. Let me go back to the PowerPoint for a second, and I want to mention very briefly, I alluded to this in an earlier video about diversionary aircraft criteria, where a couple years ago I was invited to speak at Purdue's aviation department, had an auditorium full of about 200 flight students, flight instructors, couple professors, and I set them up with the following scenario. So I told them that they're on a solo cross-country flight in a Cirrus SR-20, they have a lot of SR-20s up there, going from Goshen, Indiana up north down to Terre Haute, Indiana, over on the west side of Indiana at 8,500 feet, MSL. Hey, good westbound VFR cruising altitude, right? Beautiful day. They got about 2 hours of gas on board in the solo cross country. The winds are aloft on this flight, about 300 at 30 knots, okay? And as they happen to come up on a point where they're just about crossing the line that would go directly from Lafayette, which is their home airport at Purdue University, over towards Frankfort, Indiana. They would have Lafayette about 9 miles away over on the right, Frankfort about 11 miles over on the left. Suddenly, okay, and this is what it would look like. So as they're tracking, this would be what the PFD would look like in an airplane like that, the Cirrus SR-20 with the Garmin. Okay, so they're going direct to Terre Haute, Holman Field. The autopilot's flying, tracking a GPS course direct. Now, the course appears to be off in a different direction than the airplane's pointed, and that's because the airplane has a crab angle. In this particular avionics setup, that magenta diamond is showing your actual course across the ground, while this is showing your heading. So this airplane's heading 221. It's actually going about a 209, 210 across the ground, which is keeping this centered. And the reason for that wind drift, the wind is about 300 at 30, okay, 8,500 feet. And if I go to the next slide, by the way, I do have the nearest airports queued up here. So at some point, Lafayette's only about 9 miles away off to the right. Frankfurt is, at the moment here, showing about 10.6 miles. So it's clearly the farther airport. Ignore 1 India 9. For our purposes, we're just going to, for the moment, kind of assume that doesn't exist. Suddenly you're flying along, you have an oil pressure problem, oil on the windshield, you know your engine's getting ready to fail, and within about 30 seconds make a decision about where you want to go. Do you want to go to Lafayette or do you want to go to Frankfurt? By the way, here's what the MFD would look like. This is in a track up map, And so the track is up. So the crab angle, about 10 degrees into the wind, is shown by the airplane being pointed kind of over in this direction, even though it's tracking straight ahead. You can just eyeball it. Here's Lafayette, a bit closer than Frankfurt, but remember the wind is 300 at 30. 300 is perpendicular to our desired course. For the people in the room who raised their hands going to Lafayette, and I showed them this mathematically. I'm not going to take the time to do that here. What happened was they turned to the nearest airport. It's their home base. It's towered. It has ARF on the field. That's where their car is. They have friends who can pick them up there. Okay, that's where the mechanics are. And guess what? If they turn for Lafayette, they're turning into the wind. They will never make it, and in fact, the last couple miles in are urban area. That's going to be a tad on the ugly side. If instead they go to the farther airport, which has no tower, no on-field ARF, shorter runway, there's some mechanics on the field, okay, and so on, they make it with about 4,000 feet of altitude to spare because they're riding the tailwind even if they fly the wrong speed. So you'll have to take my word for it that I was comfortable showing that, including all the math, to about 200 people up at wonderful Purdue University. Let me give you one more example, and then we're going to wrap this video up. We will take a few minutes on this example. So to do that, let me go back to the PDFs here, and I want to look at the NTSB safety recommendation report that came out in August of 2016. So the safety recommendations report, where they recommended that the FAA radically change emergency training for air traffic controllers, they cited 5 exemplar accidents. One of the accidents they cited is this one that occurred January 4th of 2013, Palm Coast, Florida. A Beech H-35 November 375 Bravo experienced a loss of engine power and was being vectored for an approach. Part of the problem is during this engine failure situation that the clouds were about 900 overcast, and this pilot did not have GPS. He was asking for vectors. IMC dead stick vectoring is an almost impossible task, but for the moment I want to constrain my remarks to what the winds aloft were and so on. Just for the record, the airplane ended up short of the runway. The private pilot and his 2 passengers died. The airplane was destroyed. So the 3 on board were killed. The person in the house was not injured, for what it's worth. But anyway, I want to note for the record that if you read through just the brief summary here, just for the purposes of this report, it basically just says engine failure. It then became a total power failure, even though that hadn't occurred initially. Although the failure occurred almost directly over an airport, the controller vectored the airplane away from the airport far enough that when they turned back in, they ended up about a mile short of the runway. I'm going to argue in a separate case study video that the NTSB is correct about part of this because the controllers didn't understand when the engine lost total power, but there's something else that even the NTSB missed. I have talked to the NTSB, including some of the investigators who directly investigated this accident, about my concerns. So let me look at the final report for November 375 Bravo. This will go into a little more detail, and again, so this is going to say that it had the engine failure, partial at first, then total failure, and so on. They vectored the airplane such that it was unable to reach the airport. This was likely due to the weather conditions and the controller's incomplete understanding of the airplane's mechanical condition. Now, the weather conditions, what the NTSB is referring to here is just the cloud cover, which again was ballpark 900 feet overcast, okay, cloud ceilings of 900 to 1,000 feet. And so the controllers were kind of stuck. I mean, do we vector them, for a full instrument approach? Well, they can't do that. He's descending too fast, so we got to keep him in tight. How tight do we keep him, and so on. But again, the thing that the NTSB missed, even though they talk about the weather conditions, and since this is a video about winds aloft, you can kind of get a sense of where I'm going with this. They don't talk about the winds aloft in this. So they're going to talk about the clouds being down low and so on. And they will talk about the winds, but only in a very tangential way. And the place to look for that is here in the Air Traffic Control Group Factual Report. Okay, so for what it's worth, this is the most detailed information about the ATC handling of the situation. And I want to start by looking very briefly at the map of the flight. So they had gone past Daytona, they had gone past Ormond Beach, and right about here, when they're about 5.5 from Ormond Beach, about 7 from Flagler County, the identifier is now changed. It's no longer X-Ray Foxtrot Lima. But when right about here, the pilot said he had a vibration in the prop that does not initially mean that you just automatically send them to Ormond because it's closest. It takes a few seconds for that to sort of register with the controller to understand what the pilot's desires are. He's still traveling along northwestbound and so on. And actually, by the time that any reasonable controller would have made a divert option, Flagler was mathematically the closest airport and so on. Okay, and you can see that what they did was they vectored them up kind of to the northeast, brought them back down a little bit offshore, brought them back in, trying to bring them back in for runway 29, and they ended up a bit short, okay, by about a mile and so on. So that's basically what happened, but here's what I want you to kind of observe, especially because we're talking about winds aloft. So first of all, in the history of the flight, when the problem first presented, and in just that first minute the controller was deciding where to send the airplane, there's this little note here that says, according to the approach controller, Ormond Beach, which was located approximately 6 miles southeast, was briefly considered. However, one of the runways was closed. That's not really decisive here. But it says there had been a strong tailwind for 17, and because of that, the airport was not an option. If it's a strong tailwind for 17, that's perfect. Glide downwind, land upwind. Even if you wait for another minute, even if another 2 minutes, if you have that strong wind for 17, I've sat down, I've done the math, I've done this in the simulator, you get there with altitude to spare. Now you can still get to Flagler, so they're both reachable. The only point I want to make at the moment is Ormond Beach was rejected because of the strong tailwind. That's not true. And if you sit down, do the math, Daytona Beach was also easily reachable. Now let's go a little bit farther into this report. It is going to talk about weather information, but the NTSB should be looking at the winds aloft, and they don't. All they're doing is reporting the surface weather at the 3 airports, Flagler, Ormond Beach, and Daytona, and they have nothing in the weather information about the winds aloft. I have tried with the NTSB since this accident occurred to get the winds aloft. I didn't get started until about 3 years later, and by that time it was too late and so on. Okay, I began looking at it when this NTSB recommendation report came out. One last thing about the winds from this report, if you look at the account for the North Radar Arrival Controller and so on, it says a couple of things in here. Okay, so one, there was a strong north wind that day, which caused the airplane to drift off final. So there's a strong north wind. And then there is another thing here. The only airport that it could land at was Flagler. Ormond had a north-northwest wind at about 25 knots, which would have created a tailwind for aircraft landing from the north. What happens is controllers aren't thinking about the winds aloft. Even the NTSB isn't thinking about the winds aloft. And for what it's worth, I decided to do a quick check this morning. As I was preparing this video, I just did a quick Google search. I was aware a couple years ago that this had become a lawsuit. I've literally had no idea for about 3 years or so how the lawsuit turned out. So until I specifically looked for it this morning, I found out what the lawsuit was. For the record, the government was sued, alleging that the controllers didn't know how to vector, and that was the proximate cause for the accident. I disagree with plaintiff's argument in that, and I do think that the correct judgment was rendered here. However, for what it's worth, all of the debate in here is about when the engine failed, maybe when the gear went down and so on. And while this isn't decisive, I did read through the whole thing this morning. If I search for wind, okay, there are 6 occurrences. First one is just part of window. The engine was windmilling. Wind was from the north. We saw that from the report, okay. They did not give the pilot information such as the wind direction, wind speed, and so on at the surface, okay. And then there's just a general thing about when PIREPs have to be provided to pilots, including for wind shear and turbulence. Nobody, not the legal experts, not the NTSB, nobody live at the time was thinking about winds aloft, and they are huge. I absolutely want controllers to look at it, and so we're going to wrap up this way. We'll go back to the PowerPoint, and where did it go? It is, oops, sorry, it was that MFD. So in summary, this is what happens in a live shot, folks. I say that with a smile. Winds aloft, again, they can have an enormous effect on aircraft glide performance. And that reminds me, this also happens in a live shot. There's one other thing I forgot to mention. My apologies while I go back. I want you to look at this and understand why the airplane ended up short of the runway. Here's why. This is a zoomed in portion of the final few minutes of the flight. And what I want you to notice, again, the wind, as far as I can deduce from detailed mathematical look at the radar plot, I'm not going to show you that detailed math here. The winds aloft, as far as I can deduce, were something like 300, 310 degrees at about 40 knots for most of the gliding portion of the flight. And you can kind of see that. This isn't proof, but you can kind of see it if you eyeball it. Look at the regular spacing of these radar returns as the airplane is heading essentially downwind. You can see gaps between each of these dots, but then when the pilot turns back into the wind, look at the spacing on the dots. A couple times there's like a hit or so on the radar that's missing, and then radar contact is lost about 3/4 of a mile before the airplane impacted the house. But these dots, if you go through it mathematically, this guy was doing like 160 knots across the ground. He turned back into the wind, and all of a sudden he was doing 80, and the whole time the rate of descent was unchanged. He was doing about 1,000 feet a minute. This guy was gliding at something like 120 knots airspeed. He had a 40-knot tailwind, and so he was moving eastbound at a good clip. Great glide ratio, probably about 16-to-1 at 160 knots and 1,000 feet per minute. He then turns back in. The glide ratio plummets to an 8-to-1 glide ratio, and he ends up predictably a mile short. It's hard to kind of get your head around this. It's one of the many reasons why IMC dead stick vectoring is almost impossible to do. I will cover that in later portions of the flight. But in general, and pardon my my slight interruptions here as I recorded this live, these are the takeaways. Winds aloft can have an enormous effect on aircraft glide performance. So in my opinion, when there's an engine failure event, controllers must quickly assess the winds aloft. And generally speaking, the tipping point is when the winds aloft at about halfway between where the airplane is right now in altitude and the local terrain are greater than about 15 knots. So that's always going to have to be a little bit of a judgment call. But for the sake of discussion, if it's a sea level area, the plane's at 6,000 feet, you grab those 3,000 foot winds and you kind of roughly assume that will be the average wind on the way down. If it's less than about 15 knots, it's not that big a deal. It's not going to have much effect. Just kind of do things normally. But bigger than about 15 knots, certainly more than 30. If the winds are more than 30, you absolutely have to take it into account. 15 to 30, you should. In most cases, it's kind of forgivable if you don't, okay? And then once you do that, I want you to think about having an airplane glide downwind towards a Norman Beach, a Daytona Beach for that matter, and then turn around easily with altitude to spare and land upwind. Ultimately, and sadly, going into Flagler that day, the airplane, as you saw, was able to go out past the airport, come back. If only we'd known, because of the winds aloft, to vector him a little bit tighter. Nobody knows that. The NTSB didn't even look at it. None of the legal experts on the plaintiff side or the government side in that lawsuit testified to it. Nobody's looking at the winds aloft. I want that to change. Thank you. Have a good day.